The legal age requirement is one that's, it sort of doesn't necessarily fit. Here we're saying competent party is somebody who understands. You could have a person who is below the legal age, who is a genius, and who is very wise. Maybe they finished college at age 16. They have a driver's license. They have a very high IQ. But we will, depending upon what the state declares to be the legal age, we will say they're not competent. They are missing one of the essential elements. So it kind of flies in the face of logic if we have a very intelligent, very wise, very well educated, very mature individual, but they fall below this arbitrary age limit. So, what's the logic for that? Well, the logic is that there's a state statute. Every state and perhaps federal agency or federal law may say that we're going to determine that unless a person has reached a certain age, that even though they have all the elements of understanding, because they're what we would call tender years, meaning young and perhaps not experienced in the world, that person is not going to be considered to have the capacity to enter into a contract. In Colorado, that age is 18, and in many states, it's the arbitrary age of 18. So a person, an individual who's 17 and a half years old, but looks more mature, has an education, has all of the outward appearances of being older than 18, if they're not in fact over 18, they are going to have an escape clause from this contract, because we say by law we have decided they are not a competent party. And as you'll see later in the following chapters, what we say is a minor, person under the legal age as established by the law of whatever state or jurisdiction we're talking about. If they're under that age, that contract is a voidable contract, meaning it could be considered valid if the minor wants to go through with it. But the minor is going to have an escape clause. They can say, I exercise my right to void this contract. Perfect example is a young person buys an automobile for cash, pays cash. The seller thinks they're dealing with an adult because the person looks like an adult. Maybe they even have a false ID or passport documents that say they're of legal age. But if it turns out, 6 months, a year, maybe even 2 years after this minor passes the age of 18, this minor can still come back and say, look, you know what, I wasn't of legal age, and I want my money back. And here's the car. It's got 10,000 more miles on it, it's not working right, and I want my 5,000 back. Now that may seem unfair, because the seller didn't have the right to back out of the contract just because the buyer was a minor, but the minor is given this special protection that allows them to avoid responsibility and to void the contract. Now, as in everything in the law, there are possibilities for exceptions to that. Let's say that the item that was being purchased by the minor is what we would consider a necessity of life. An example of a necessity of life is food, a place to sleep, somewhere to come in out of the freezing cold in the wintertime. So there are things that could be considered necessities of life, and the minor might think they have the right to avoid it, but if it is actually a necessity of life, then the minor loses that right unless there's some other extenuating circumstance. An argument could be made that a 17-and-a-half-year-old who has graduated from college, who has a job, who looks mature, who has a very high IQ, and needs the automobile, a modest-priced automobile, not a $125,000 Mercedes-Benz, but a $5,000 4-year-old Ford Focus, basic transportation. A court could say that for this person was a necessity of life. They needed that automobile for work. They needed that automobile to meet family obligations. So many of these things that we talk about in the law have escape clauses or loopholes. But generally, You know, if it's just a general garden variety situation, being under the legal age of being granted the right to enter into a contract means that you're not a competent party. The courts will let that minor out of the contract. Now, as we move on,